All right. What I wanted to look at tonight is the overall structure of the book of Shoftim. Translated typically as the book of Judges, will address the question of the translation of the word shofet as judge in a later shir, either next week or the week after. Um, it's an interesting translation and certainly comes from the way we attribute or use the term in Chumash. Whether that's appropriate or accurate in this context, we will see. But the book of Judges, in many ways, is unique in that it is remarkably structured and consistent in its structure. Essentially, the book it divides up into three parts. There's an initial introduction, which we're going to look at tonight. We're going to look at chapters 1 and beginning of chapter 2. Then there is a repetitive structure style that goes from chapter 2 through chapter 16, and then the last 4 or 5 chapters are a unit unto themselves. And that's what I want to show you this evening. Starting with chapter 1, Vayhi achrei mot Yoshua, after the death of Yoshua. The death of Yoshua is the last event chronicled at the end of the book of Yoshua. And so there seems to be a sense that this is the continuation. We go straight from the death of Yoshua to the next unit, which is the continuation of the conquest of each tribe in their territory as they sitting in the land of Israel. By Yishalu b'nei Yisrael b'Hashem lemor, who should go first against the Canaanites and fight with them? And God's answer, Vayomer Hashem Yehuda ya'aleh. Yehuda should go first. And we'll talk about Yehuda and all of this episode next week. But there is that sense, like we're continuing exactly where we left off, but it's not so simple. And the reason it's not so simple is because if I go one chapter forward into chapter 2, again, I'm assuming we have a tabula rasa. I'm assuming we don't know anything about the book yet. But if I go into chapter 2 and I read in verse 6, Vayishalach Yehoshua et ha'am vayelchu ibnei Yisrael ish lenachalato. Yehoshua sent the people back to their land, to their territory, each tribe to their inheritance. And in verse 8, Vayamot Yehoshua benun eved Hashem. Yehoshua dies. So now I'm very confused because I haven't even gotten into the text yet, and Yehoshua dies in verse 8 of chapter 2, and yet he died in chapter 1, verse 1. So we're, you can't, to be, somewhat cynical, you can't die twice. So what is the meaning of this structure? So essentially it's taking us into a kind of a brief synopsis of a snapshot of where we're holding at the end of the book of Yoshua. Where we're holding at the end of the book of Yoshua is the land of Israel, more or less, is conquered in the sense, I'm going to look for a quick map, that's not here, okay. Here's the map. More or less with the orange, and we're going to look at it in detail in a second, the orange is the area of Israelite control. The dark orange arrow is essentially the conquests of Yehoshua. Yehoshua enters into the land of Israel together with the army of Israel, the people of Israel, and he has broad conquests that gain control over the land in its various military perspective. However, that's not the goal. The goal isn't control of the roads or control of the land. The goal is for each tribe to settle in their territory. And as we'll see in a moment, the question of what to do with the Canaanite population that's there. And the yellow essentially are the Canaanite-controlled areas by the time the book of Yeshua closes. And as you can see, more or less, I'll leave out the east side of the Yarden for a moment. On the west side of the Yarden, Israel in the time of Yoshua, the time of the Shoftim, more or less looks like Judea and Samaria today, like Judah and Shimon today. Right? Israel lives in the hills, and the Israelites live in the hills, and the Canaanites are on the coast. Sort of a reversal of where the centers of population are in modern Israel. So the snapshot here is to record what was achieved and what wasn't achieved. Skipping for a moment the story of Yehuda and Shimon, okay, which we'll come back to. But if I go to the end of chapter 1, we have a record. I'm just going to read pieces of it. Bnei Yosef went to Beit El, and let's go up to the end of it. V'lo harish, where is it? V'lo harish Menashe et Beit Shan v'et bnotah v'et Tanach v'et bnotah v'et Yoshvei Dor v'et bnotah. Menashe did not inherit or settle or drive out the inhabitants. We'll see what that means in a moment. From the areas of Beit Shan and Tanach and Dor and Yivlaam, etc. And therefore, Vayoel Knani Lashevet Ba'aretz. The Canaanites continued to continued to dwell in the land. There would come a time, there would come a time when Israel would be strong, and the Canaanites would have to pay some kind of a tribute. This is a very bad translation. They would have to pay some sort of a tribute or some sort of a tax or recognition of the status of Israel as the sovereign nation of the land. But the Canaanites were not removed from the land. And that is described here as a critique of what Menashe was able to accomplish. Similarly, Ephraim, lo horisha Knaniyah yoshev b'Gaza. Ephraim was unable to remove the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer, and therefore the Canaanites, vayeshev Knani b'kilbo b'Gaza, the Canaanites continued to dwell there. Zvulun did not drive out the inhabitants of the areas of Kitron and Halol, and continued to dwell in their midst. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of the area of Akko, and Sidon, and Achlav, and Achziv, and Chalba, and therefore the tribe of Asher, Vayeshev Hashvi B'Kerav Knani, they continued to live amongst the inhabitants amongst the Canaanites, but the Canaanites were the majority of the people in that area, Yoshvei Haaretz Ki Lo Horishu. Similarly with Naphtali. In other words, what chapter 1 leaves us with is not a function, as it seems to start, with, okay, who should go first to continue the conquest of the land of Israel? And the answer is Judah. It's not a function of who is successful, but rather a critique of who is unsuccessful. And for the most part, chapter 1 of the book of Yeshua picks up where Yeshua left off, not in the last chapter of Sefer Yeshua, but in the second to last chapter. If you go back to the book of Yeshua, in chapter 23, Yeshua gathers all the people together in the end of his life. Yeshua Zaken Ba Bayamim. This is now in Yeshua chapter 23. I'm going back a little bit just to do a quick review for the benefit of those who were with us in Sefer Yeshua, and for the benefit of those who were not, it's important to see the continuity. And Yeshua gathers together all the elders, and he says to them, "Ani zakanti bata bayamim, I am old, v'atem li'item et kol asher asa Hashem Elokechem l'chol hagoyim ha'ele mifnechem." You've seen all that God has done to these nations and the wars that we've succeeded in driving out and gaining control in the region. Ki Hashem Elokechem hu nilcham lachem. You know that it is God who has fought at your side. However, there are many nations that are left, and I leave them with you. I have divided the land according to your tribes, and it is your task now to deal with these nations. God will assist you. God will remove them from your midst. He will drive them out before you. And you shall possess their land, and you shall inherit, and you shall take their land. And be strong in this. Don't be hesitant. Don't procrastinate. Don't be weak. And do not allow these nations to remain. Why? And here's the critical issue. It's not about their physical presence. The physical presence was allowed, and we'll see that in the Torah in a moment. What was not allowed was their cultural presence, meaning the idolatry of the culture of idolatry, which was ubiquitous and synonymous with the Canaanite presence. It was the idolatry that was particularly pernicious and dangerous to allow to remain in the land. Do not mention their names of their gods, do not swear by them, do not serve them, do not worship them. But you shall cleave to Hashem your God, as you have done until this time. And therefore, God has removed these great and powerful nations, and they have not stood in your way. However, you have to guard yourself now, to love God, and not to step back from that loyalty, and not to enable these nations to remain in your midst. If you shall retract and you shall return to the path of these nations and cleave to them, and we'll see what that means, and allow them to stay as equals in the land, and marry them, and they marry you, and you become one big happy family, then God will not continue to remove these nations from your midst, and they will become for you a snare and a trap, and a scourge in your side and a prick in your eyes, until ultimately you perish from upon this land. Yeshua's final message to the people was very striking, very stark. What he basically charged them with is, don't stop. Don't let the nations of Canaan get a stronghold, and don't enter into a covenant with them, into a brit of equality with them, primarily because what was restricted, what was prohibited, was to enable the culture of idolatry to remain in this land. The criteria, the brit, the contract by which God brought us into the land of Israel was to create an idolatry-free zone in the land. That mandate was established in the Torah as the mandate for which we entered the land. And it's that contract that Yeshua says to the people, don't breach, don't renege on that agreement to remove the idolatry and the cultures of idolatry from this land. If you come back for a moment to Chumash, to the book of Bamidbar, the core message of Yeshua in this chapter, and therefore the core message by which the book of Shoftim begins, is encapsulated in Bamidbar Parak Lamed Gimel. And there, after description of the borders of the land of Israel and the travel journey of the land of Israel to get here, Pasuk says the following. This is Bamidbar Parak Lamed Gimel. They're standing at the eastern border of the Jordan River in the land of Moab, and God says to Moshe as follows: say to Israel, you will cross over the Jordan and enter the land of Israel. You will drive the inhabitants of the land out, and destroy their idols, and destroy their molten images, the graven images, and destroy their high places of worship. This is the key issue, is that these nations of Canaan are inherently idolatrous, and we need to stop for a moment and understand what idolatry was. Because in modern terminology, the mandate to drive out the inhabitants of Canaan sounds very harsh, and there are terms that are used in today's lexicon that have been thrown at the accusation against Israel for it, and we need to take a moment's pause to recognize that the culture of idolatry was by definition immoral, even by modern standards. One of the most common idolatries at the time was Baal and Molech. Molech was a culture of child sacrifice, literally in the fires of Molech. And Baal, Chazal have a very euphemistic description of what the idolatry of Baal was, but it was a fertility god. It was a god of rain. And ancient fertility rites were essentially sexual in nature. You worshipped the god of rain and the god of the land, the trees and the produce of the land, the tree of Asherah and the god, the deity of fertility. You worship it by emulating it. And if you're emulating fertility rites, then you're emulating essentially sexuality. And that was done through various immoral behaviors with regards to virgins and women, etc. So you cannot understand the war, literally, that the Torah goes to against the idolatries of Canaan without realizing that they were, by their definition, immoral cultures. And so if they were replete with the very three primary violations of the Torah's three cardinal sins were idolatry, adultery, and murder. And these idolatrous cultures were filled with murder and adultery or sexual violence. That was what they were. And when the Torah says you cannot allow this culture to remain in your midst, you cannot enter into a brit with them, as we'll see the language in a moment, this was essentially the mandate, the reason for it, because they were inherently immoral. Now, if they chose to abandon the idolatry and therefore the immorality of these cultures, and if they chose to accept the seven laws of Noah, which was the antidote or the resolution to the immorality of idolatry, they could remain. And that's universally accepted by the Rishonim. The Rambam says it explicitly, even about Amalek. The Rambam says if they chose to make peace and they chose to accept the seven mitzvot b'nei Noach, you could leave them in the land. The issue here was the idolatrous cultures of Canaan, not necessarily the racial identity of them as Canaanite nations. I think that's very important to recognize. Let me just go on for a moment. You will take possession of this land, where I've given it to you as an inheritance. You will divide the land according to the lots of the Goral. And it goes on to say, if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land, the ones who remain behind and become a cultural draw to you will become they will become like pricks in your eyes and thorns in your sides, exactly the same language that we saw in Yoshua, and they will harass you in the land in which you are. This was the primary mandate of the Torah, not to make a brit with them, not to engage with them, and not to allow the culture of idolatry to remain behind. Says Yeshua in the last chapter in his warning to the people, the land has remained, for the most part, significantly unconquered, unsettled, and that's more or less where Yeshua leaves them. He divides them by tribe. He scatters them through the land, each tribe in their own territory, mandates them to settle and therefore deal with the local inhabitants, the Canaanites. And for the most part, that's where Sefer Yeshua begins, where Sefer Shoftim begins. Were they or they not successful? What part of Yeshua's mandate to them and warning to them and heeding to them did they listen? And that's where Shoftim begins, the tragedy of their failure to do what Yeshua mandated them to do after his life. Yeshua ends his career essentially with this warning. If I go back to Yeshua chapter 13, Yeshua was getting old. He had finished the conquest of the land by control militarily. You've gotten old, you come to the end of your life. The land is still yet unconquered, unpossessed. And the Nevi goes on to list all the places that were yet unpossessed, meaning the Canaanite strongholds. And essentially, if you look at this map, the orange again is where Israel settled, and the green, for the most part, is where the Canaanites were still in control of the land. And that's the message that Yeshua leaves them with in chapter 13, and more or less the same message that he leaves them with in chapter 23, where he says, this is now your mandate. So if we come back to Sefer Yoshua for a second, right? This is the opening chapter, if you will, that has an overview of where we're at. What's the snapshot of the status of the land of Israel at the end of the period of Yeshua's life, Yahweh Mot Yeshua. And for the most part, the Israelites are sitting in the mountain ranges of Judah and Shomron, and the Canaanites are sitting on the coast and in the valley of Jezreel Valley of Emek Yisrael, and in the north in the area of Lebanon. And that's how the story begins. Again, my goal for tonight, again, is to do an overview of the book, so I want to actually start from chapter 2 for a moment. Vayal malach Hashem min hagilgal labochim. A malach, an angel, translation here, probably not an angel, it's probably a prophet or a navi of some kind. Maybe even Chazal say, in many of the Farshim take the approach of the Medrash that it was Pinchas, the high priest. Malach can be a reference to a navi, the prophet Malachi, who's called Malach. Malachi means my messenger. I don't think it's in the meaning of an angel in the where we use the term in other parts of Tanakh. Gilgal was the base camp initially, and this Navi comes to them in a city which will eventually become known as Bochim, because they cry there after his words. And he says to them, I brought you out of Egypt. I brought you to this land that I swore I would give to your forefathers that I would give to you. And I made one request. And I said to them, I said, I will not break my covenant with you. I will keep my covenant. But I made one request of you. Ve'atem lo tichletu brit miyeshvei haaretz hazot. My one mandate, my one request was not to make a brit with the local inhabitants of the Canaanites. Now, understand what a brit is. The difference between a brit and what was eventually mandated even of the nations that were allowed to remain is that it really depends on sovereignty and control. If you have local Canaanites who accept the mandate to create an idolatry-free zone in the land, then they become bayulamas, they become a tribute, meaning they pay taxes, they recognize sovereignty, they recognize the laws of the land. A brit is a contract between two equal partners. And the mandate of the Torah is not to enable the Canaanite idolatrous cultures to become equal in power and status to the land of Israel and the Torah. Therefore, not to make a brit with the local inhabitants means to destroy their altars, and destroy their high places, and destroy their places of idolatry, and not allow the idolatrous cultures to take hold. And you didn't listen to me. Mazot asita. What did you do? I said, I will not drive them out from before. I promised I would drive them out. But I now am rethinking that and saying I will not drive them out. That they shall be for you a thorn in your side, and their gods will become a snare, because the cultures will become attracted to you and you will be drawn into them. We'll talk about that in a moment. And that's the message. And he leaves them with that message. It's a warning that they have essentially failed in this one mandated task. Torah sets this task out for them. Yeshua set this task out for them. And in that one opening chapter of Yeshua in chapter 1, we have a snapshot of the land and the Canaanite strongholds that remain, and the people are warned they have failed in this one task. When the Malach Hashem, when this Rabbi finished speaking these words, the people raised their voices in tears and wept. They cried. Vayikra Shem hamakom hahu bochim. They even named the place of tears. Vayizbachu Shem LaHashem, and they brought sacrifices to God. Vayishalach Yoshua et ha'am vayilchu ish bnei Yisrael ish lenachalato lereshet et haaretz. Yeshua sent them back to their territory, back to the tribes, to continue the process of possessing the land. And that's more or less where the story of where the introduction of the book of Shoftim starts. So this chapter 1 leads directly into this message in chapter 2, and it's the setting by which the story of the book takes place. Before I move on for a second and to see what happens next, I just want to understand what this contrast of what was expected of them between the time of Yeshua and the time just subsequent to Yeshua. Because I want to make it clear, what was mandated of them was not a kind of a war period of time of warring with the nations of Canaan forever. Right? That wasn't the issue. If you go back to Chumash, again, go back to the mandate in Chumash is, on the one hand, we have such a notion of going to war quickly, don't take Canaanites and turn them into servants and etc. We have a mandate to take control over the land of Israel quick in initial stages that is quick and decisive. But at the same time, if I look at description of the conquest of Canaan, for example, in Shemot Perek Chav Gimel, it says, "Et emati eshalach lefanecha," I will send my fear upon the nations before you. I will remove the nations that are there. Your enemies will turn their backs on you. I will send some sort of, it says, it's translated as a hornet. It's not clear what this is. You are going to come into the land of Israel, and the Canaanite nations are going to already pick up and leave. However, no, I'm not going to do this in 1 year. It's not going to happen right away. You're not going to walk into the land of Israel in the days of Yeshua and conquer the entire land, and the Canaanites are all going to leave. Because if you take a land and you empty it of its population, Israel is a small population. You empty the land of all its population, right? Then the animals of the jungle will come, and then the land will become a desolation, etc. That's not the way it's going to happen. It'll take time, step by step, until you are able to be fruitful, multiply, and inherit the land, and hold on to the land. And then I will expand your borders. But when it comes to the nations of Canaan, I will give you the land of those nations of Canaan. You may not make a brit, a covenant with them or with their gods. And that's the key issue. The issue is a cultural battle against the idolatry of the time. And not to make a brit with them, which would give status to them, and every contract begins with an acknowledgement of the deity to which the nations identify. And you give credence and legitimacy to the cultural power of these idolatrous nations. Not to make a covenant with them or their gods. Therefore, not to let them remain in the land, lest they cause you to sin against me. You will be drawn to serve their gods. They will become a snare for you. Again, same message. Shemot Perek Chav Gimel, Bamidbar Perek Lamed Gimel, Yoshua Perek Chav Gimel, and now your Shoftim Perek Bet. It's the same message all along. The issue was to remove the land to make the land of Israel an idolatry-free zone. And for that, Yeshua engages in the conquest of Canaan on 2 levels. Step 1 is the first half of Sefer Yeshua, which is to take control of the land, the roads, the highways, the cities, to have that the tribes of Israel can travel, can be in the land, essentially not to drive out the Canaanites, but to essentially describe and define the territory for each tribe. Step two, which is where Yeshua leaves them and mandates of them from Yeshua Parak Yud Gimel until the end of the book, is for each tribe to then go and address the region in which they were assigned. And in that way, to establish this is the area of Menashe, this is the area of Yosef, this is the area of Ephraim, this is the area of Asher and Naphtali, and in that region to make sure that this was an idolatry-free zone. So what went wrong? It's a question. What went wrong? Yeshua leaves them with a mission. Did they or didn't they pick up where he left off? The very fact that the book begins with Mot Yoshua, and some tribes continue the conquest and some did not, tells me that they failed. Why? And the key to why is where I left off here in chapter 2. Vayshalach Yeshua ta'am v'echu b'nei Yisrael ish l'nachalato l'reshet hadaretz. Yeshua sent the people to their tribes, each tribe to their land, and Yeshua dies in this moment. Vayavdu ha'am et Hashem kol yemei Yoshua. The people continued to serve God loyally all the days of Yeshua. And all the days of the elders, this verse is a repeat of the verse that appears at the end of Sefer Yeshua. All the days of the elders that continued after Yeshua. Meaning the generation the generation that saw the great miracles of the crossing of the Yarden and the conquest of Canaan. But Vayamat Yeshua ben Nun Eved Hashem. Yeshua ben Nun Eved Hashem died. And he died at the age of 110. So that's also the chronology of Sefer Yeshua is interesting, how long it takes, and etc. He dies at the age of 110, same age as Yosef. And the repeat of the burial, he's buried in the tribal territory of Ephraim. And here's the key verse. V'gam kol ador hahu nesfu lavotav. That entire generation gathered to their fathers, meaning we're now one generation later. Vayakom dor acher achreihem asher lo yadu et Hashem. New generation arose that did not know God. That verse is very powerful because it's exactly modeled after a verse that appears in Chumash. Namely, Vayakom melech chadash asher lo yadat Yosef. Beginning of the slavery in Egypt, a new king arose that did not know Joseph. It even starts earlier. It says that the tribes, Yaakov died, and the tribes died, and all of that generation, right? All after the death of the generation of Yosef, a new king arose who did not know Yosef. Did not know Yosef. And in our case, exactly the same phenomenon, only in reverse, meaning it's happening to us. That generation passed away, and the new generation arose. Asher lo yadu et Hashem v'gam et ma'aseh asher aseh Yisrael, did not know firsthand of the great miracles. They didn't see them. It didn't experience them. Sure, they heard them from their parents. Sure, there was a Masorah. Sure, they told stories around the Friday night Shabbos table. But that's different than seeing it with their own eyes and experiencing it themselves. And so the story begins. V'yasu b'nei Yisrael et hara b'nei Hashem v'yavdu et ha'ba'alim. Israel begins to do evil in the sight of God by worshiping the gods of the Canaanites. And the very warning that the Torah set out in clear terms, not to make a breach with them, not to let the culture of idolatry remain. You see here, the issue isn't that the Canaanites are there, meaning it's not the population that's the concern. It's v'yavdu et ha'ba'alim, it's that they allow the culture of idolatry, Baal, Ashtoret, right, to become attractive to the Israelites, to the people who are living there. And therefore, they abandoned God, took them out of Egypt. And they went after these other gods, and followed all the gods of the nations that were around them. They bowed to them, and they provoked God. They abandoned God. They abandoned Baal, and they worshipped the Baal and Ashtoreth, and they worshipped these fertility gods, and they worshipped other gods, including Molech, as we'll see. God got angry. I'll deal with the rest of this in a moment. But the key to this story, understanding the transition between Yeshua and Shoftim, lies here, and it lies right here at this moment. Because if you don't deal with the Canaanite culture and the idolatry right away, if you don't establish the parameters and the criteria by which the nations of Canaan, if they want to stay behind, if they want to remain in this land, can, which is to remove the idolatry, the result is a new generation will be born. Of course, a new generation is going to be born. That's the whole point. It's not so fast. Because what was offensive to Yeshua, an offensive to Moshe, an offensive to the Jews who left Egypt, who understood the evil of idolatry, what was offensive to the generation that entered into the land of Israel was less offensive to the generation that was born, for which it was now the norm. And so if your next door neighbors are worshiping Molech or Milcom, which is the god of Ammon and Moab, right across the river. So all the people of Reuven and Gad, they're next door neighbors, and the tribes of Ammon and Moab are just over the border. They're worshiping Molech. They're engaged in child sacrifice. Molech is a cult of burning children in fire. And so to the parent generation, that was offensive. That was horrible. How could you even tolerate such a thing? You would go to war over such things. Remove the immorality of the immoral cultures in your midst. But the next generation, they were born with these Molech fires and their next door neighbors. And for them, it was just their average Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday ritual. And suddenly, what was so abhorrent to the parent generation, new generation arose. And now this has become the norm. And the idolatry of Baal had an additional attraction to it in that it was enticing. It wasn't just offensive, it was also enticing, because it was by its nature a fertility deity, and that was sexual in nature. And so, next, as we look next week or the week after the story of Shulman, we'll see in the story about Baal, we'll see how much that was the case. And so if you don't put the boundaries and the barriers up immediately, the result is we have Tutabali. And it's very important to understand the extent to which the Torah went to war against the cultures of idolatry in Canaan is so important to understand the background of Sefer Shoftim, because it all revolves around this issue. That in every generation, as the success of one generation wears away, as the miracles of one battle wane, and the people are kind of reassociated with or aware of these cultural affinity to the idolatries of Baal, they become more attracted to them, and they get caught up in that whirlwind. And that's how the book of Shoftim begins. That's part one. Part two, as I said, I want to finish today's shir with just a kind of an overview of structure. From this introduction, which is how much of the Canaanite population / culture remained, and therefore became the very threat and the very temptation that the Torah warned about, that's chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2. What then ensues from chapter 2 through chapter 16 is and I'm sure if you've ever studied or read both the book of Shoftim, you've heard this, right, is a kind of a cycle or a spiral where, and it's encapsulated here, Hashem Israel, God would get angry at Israel, and to punish them, he would deliver them into the hands of enemies, whether they be big enemies, small enemies, plunderers. They would plunder Israel, and they would be threatened by enemies around them. In other words, the extent to which Israel would slide spiritually, God would respond by threatening them politically and physically, and enabling the enemies around them to gain a greater hold over them. They could no longer stand before their enemies. They had no way of defending against them. And God's hand against them would be calamitous, and as he spoke to them, and they would be greatly distressed. In response, Vayakom Hashem Shoftim Vayoshium miyad shoseha. God would, at the moment of either the tshuva of the nation or compassion of God, we'll see in each generation, each story, it becomes a little different, but at some point or another, they cry out to God. There is an element of tshuva. God sends a shofet, a leader. It translates it as judge. We're going to translate it as leader for now, who would save them from the hands, military victory over their enemies, with the understanding that these Shoftim would then lead them back to a tshuva to avoid, right, to go back from the very cultural affiliation with Baal and Ashtaroth that led to the calamity in the first place. But that would be short-lived. They would not listen to the judges either. And they would again go after these other gods. And they would again, this would be a pattern that would repeat themselves. God would send them judges. God would be with the judge. God would save them. And they would be loyal to God during the days of the Shofet. But then, the Shofet would die. The people would spiral and they would go back to their evil, to their ways of idolatry, and even worse than before. And this cycle would continue to go on, and it would continue, etc. So I'm not going to go through all the details of this chapter because we'll study it in depth, but this sets the stage. Chapter 2 sets the stage. There's cycles of chet, where the people abandon God and gets drawn into the very cultures of idolatry that the Torah warned us about. God would punish them, some kind of calamity. Whether we prayed and did tshuva, or whether God sent a leader who would then save them and encourage them to do tshuva after the fact, each one of those cases is different. And then after the death of the Shofet, we would do it all over again. That's the cycle, and that's the cycle of Sefer Shoftim. And if you continue to look through the text now, one by one, right, there's a continuation of chapter 3 deals with the rest of this story. Just one example. They did evil in the eyes of God. They abandoned God. God was angry. He sent them. He gave them over to the hands of the king Kushan of Aram Naharaim. They served Kushan Rishatayim for 8 years. They ended up they lost sovereignty in a sense to Kushan Rishatayim for 8 years. They cried out to God. God sent a savior, a leader to lead them. Who was it? Otniel ben Kenaz. We'll talk about him. The Spirit of God came upon him. He judged Israel. He led Israel. They went to war. They were victorious. God gave Kushan Rishatayim over into his hands. His hand prevailed against Kushan Rishatayim. The land was quiet for 40 years. If you want to mark down for yourselves, chapter 3, verse 7 through verse 11, in those verses is the encapsulation of the entire book of Shoftim. This is the cycle. Israel did evil in the eyes of God. God punished them. Here's the enemy, Kushan Mishatayim. They cried out to God. God saved them. He sent them Otniel ben Knaz. Otniel ben Knaz, a spiritual man. He led Israel into war. They were victorious. The land was quiet for 40 years. 40 years means a generation. 40 years means they were loyal to God. And then they did it again. They did evil in the eyes of God. And we're back to story number 2 and the next shofet. And this will be the pattern that will continue for each iteration. Otniel ben Knaz, Ehud ben Gera, Devorah and Barak, Yiftach, Hillel, all the Shoftim, one after the other. Each one's a little different. Each story is a little different. But that's there are going to be 350 years of this cycle in various iterations of it. And that's going to take us to the rest of the bulk of the book of Shoftim. Right? Chapter 4 begins the story of Devorah and Barak, which is chapter 4 and chapter 5. Chapter 6, the beginning of the story of Gidon. And it starts exactly the same way. Israel did evil in the eyes of God. God gave them over to the hands of Midian, etc. And the leader who led them out of that moment was Gidon. Every shofet is different. Different personality, different background, different story. That's what we're going to analyze. The chait is different. The circumstances are different. But the pattern is the same. Gidon is chapter 6 and chapter 7. Then there's a kind of a blip on the radar that's a little different. Is chapter 8 is the story of Avimelech, Gidon's half son. Chapter 8 and 9 and 10. Then we have a bunch of other shoftim, which we'll talk about. The main next story is Yiftach, which is in chapter 11. And then after Yiftach is Shimshon. And that'll take us all the way through the end of chapter 15. 15, 16. So from chapter 3 to chapter 16, the same iteration, the same story of the idolatry of the people, the cultural draw of the nations of Canaan, and the spiral of the shoftim that God sent to lead us. That ends at the end of chapter 16. That's really the end of the book. The end of Shimshon. But that's not the end of the book, because what comes next is 17, 18, 19, 20, 6 more chapters. From chapter 17 until the end of the book, chapter 21, 5 chapters, are 2 stories that do not fit this pattern at all. They're the stories known as Hesel Micha, the idol of Micha, and the story of Pilegesh Begiva, the concubine in the valley. We'll talk about what those words mean. And those are completely different stories. They don't follow any pattern of the rest of the book. They're almost like an epilogue or postscript to the book. And they are, in fact, described as just that. Most of the Mefarshim, not all, but the vast majority of the Mefarshim assume that these 2 stories are happening very early in the period of the Shoftim. They're just an addendum attached to the end of the book to be studied at the end. And the key message of this part of the story is articulated in verse 6 of chapter 17, the story of Pesel Micha. Bayamim mahem ein melech b'Yisrael ish hayashar beinam yaseh. Those days there was no king of Israel. Every man did what was right in their own eyes, or essentially what was not right in their own eyes, meaning they did what was not right because it was right in their own eyes. The mistakes here are catastrophic. And the mistakes that were made on 2 levels, and I'm not going to go through all the stories. I just want to get to the conclusion. But the mistakes made in these two stories divide the people in a way that was unimaginable in the days of Yeshua. Chapter 17, the story of Pesel Micha, is a story of a tribe of Israel that separates from the rest of the tribes of Israel, goes off on their own, and builds their own temple with their own deity and their own priesthood and their own gods. And there's a fight about it. They want to go to war. The other tribes want to go to war with it. They avoid that war because of Gidon and because Micha was a little bit too strong for them. And so they avoid the civil war that could have and should have taken place at that moment. If you remember the story at the end of Yeshua, the story of Reuven and Gad who built a Mizbeach, and how Pinchas led the tribes of Israel to fight them because how can you separate yourselves from the people? They built a monument to the Mizbeach. Here's the tribe of Dan. They built an actual temple with their own gods and their own idolatries and their own priesthood. And the people say, okay, go your happy way. There's no king of Israel. The second time in that story. And then chapter 19, which is the story of Pelegash Begiva, which is an actual civil war against the tribe of Binyamin and the city of Yavesh Gilad, two civil wars in that story. And there's no king of Israel. And the story of Pelegash Begiva, which is a horrific story, but its key is that it's two civil wars. A war in which they destroyed the tribe of Binyamin, and a war in which they destroyed the city of Yavesh Gilad. Same group of people. And the end of that story, chapter 21, concludes by Mimahen, Ein Melech B'Yisrael, Ish Yashar Beinav Yaseh. And so the two stories at the end of the book are connected by this phrase that is an indictment against the institution of leadership called the Shofet. For 350 years, we were led by a Shofet of various kinds and stripes. And for whatever reason we will study and we will try to understand in the course of our study of the book, the institution of the Shofet failed to address the blank, whatever it is, right? The needs of the people, the spiritual needs of the people, the physical needs of the people, security needs, whatever it is, the Shofet failed. And therefore the book ends with an open, almost like a begging. This story ends with an indictment. Ein Melech B'Yisrael. What we need is, now I'm going to address the question of why the institution of Melech, or king, is a solution, if it is a solution. But whatever it is, it's a failure of the institution of the Shofet. And that's how the story ends. So taking a step back, part one of the book, which is the opening chapter and a half, dealt with the failure to establish Jewish sovereignty in the land and remove the cultural influence of the Canaanite nations. So there is a land component of establishing the authority and power and sovereignty and cultural influence of Israel over the Canaanites in the land of Israel. From chapter 3 to the end of chapter 16, you have 16 or 15. End of chapter 16, you have the cultural draw of the idolatry of the nations of Canaan and the influence it has over Israel, and therefore the need for the leadership of the Shofet to resolve the idolatry draw of the Canaanites. And the last two chapters deal with the divisions internally within the people of Israel to the point of one near civil war and two actual civil wars that tear the people apart. And so if I take a step back and I look at the book of Shoftim in its three parts, the first part deals with the land of Israel and the authority of the Jewish people in the land. The second part deals with the cultural power of idolatry and its influence over the people and the sins of the people. And the third part deals with the nation of Israel and the integrity of the people of the Am. So in the language of Cook, right, you have this book that separates, divides into, or addresses the needs of the land of Israel, the Torah of Israel, and the people of Israel on three different levels. And that's the piece that puts it all together. That's the structure of the book of Shoftim. I'm actually going to stop sharing notes a moment. See all your faces.
Question.
Yes.
Let me ask you, what was the mistake? Was the mistake that Joshua didn't conquer the whole land and left partially occupied by the Philistines? Or is it expected from us to have foreign influence and withstand it?
So when we get to chapter 3 in detail, we'll have to answer that question because there are multiple sources that seem to conflict in answer to that question. In other words, were the Canaanites there as a test of our loyalty to God, or were we supposed to remove them and not have that test or temptation? And
Right.
there are different sources that seem to reflect different answers to that question. So we'll deal with it in more detail as we go along. But it's a fair question, and the answer is yes and yes. But what I think Yeshua, or what I think that people miss or didn't appreciate as much, is the power of waiting a generation. The power of waiting a generation, 2 or 3 generations, right, in terms of years, right? The power of allowing the cultural influence of the Canaanites to become the norm, I think, is what they underestimated. Any other questions?
Rabbi, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Just for clarity, the last two stories of the book of Shoftim, Pesel Micha and Plegesh Vagiva, are you saying that they're not necessarily chronologically placed? Are they possibly examples of how bad things were during the time of the Shoftim?
That's exactly what I'm saying. That's the interpretation of the majority of the Mefarshim. Not all. There are Mefarshim who place it chronologically at the end of the book. It's very difficult to do so from a Pshat perspective. What seems to be more is that you have an epilogue that kind of highlights the overarching problem of the whole book, because the issues that Pesach Micha will address and the Legash Pekiva will address are both religious divides and national divides. Right? Are we one people or 12 separate tribes, or do we worship one God or do we worship multiple gods? Right? Those are two parallel questions addressed by those two stories, and they will essentially be the themes that we'll address throughout the book. So that is exactly what I'm suggesting.
Interesting.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I put into the chat the following question. What do you take from the repetition of behavior history? Is it moral lesson? All Navi, because I've studied with the Chavrusa all of the major prophets, and now we're halfway through Trei Asar, and it's all fundamentally the same. We're bad. God punishes, promises that things will be better when Mashiach comes.
Right.
So,
Sort of the opposite of the definition of a Jewish holiday, which is they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat.
right.
Yeah, you can sort of broaden the message of every Navi to that kind of generic, we were bad, God punished us, and we did tshuva and he saved us. That pattern is exactly the pattern set out at the beginning of the book of Shoftim. And because the book of Shoftim is the first book to deal with the sins of Israel, it sets the pattern for the rest of Tanakh.
Right, but when you have prophet after prophet after prophet after, I mean, they're all doing it in very different ways. We just finished finishing Micha is different from Isha.
Here's the real issue, is that it's very difficult to study the prophets without placing each one back into its historical context of exactly to which king is he and to which period of time are they addressing. It's sort of like reading the books of the history of great speeches without knowing the context of what that speech is all about. Like, imagine reading the Gettysburg Address without ever having known anything about the American Civil War.
Right.
It becomes a kind of a almost too generic to be meaningful. And so you really need to put each one back into its
Well,
context and see
that's what
what's
I found when I asked
right.
People if they study Navi. They say no, it's all that we read the Haftorah.
Right.
So obviously that's ridiculous.
Right.
But when you do read the Navi, the Nevi'im, then you end up asking yourself, okay, is this just so we know our history and it forces us to go into the depth of history and understand?
Yeah,
Um,
there are definitely nuances that are different in each case. But I would tend to, I mean, we haven't gotten to the Book of Kings yet, but when we do, when I learned Sefer Melachim, when I learned the Book of Kings, I learned to together with the Nevi'im that were connected to them. And so it was a way to I see the nuance of the message of each prophet. It's much harder. You have to have a guide, you have to have a teacher who can kind of do that.
mhm.
But it's a much harder way to learn both the Book of Kings and the prophets. Um, but yeah, so I think the Book of Shoftim sets a pattern that, in broad strokes, is the pattern followed by the rest of Tanakh, but the nuances are different. And we're going to see that in the Book of Shoftim too. We're going to see that each Shofet is different.
So,
Each iteration through the cycle is not the same as the previous one. The sin is different, the people are different, the geography is different, the king is different,
hmm,
the shofet is different, and that's our task, is to understand the nuance
but
of the differences,
so you learn history in the process. So that's maybe one of the purposes.
right?
But the
You also
fact that
learn lessons, right? You learn history, you also learn lessons. You learn lessons of
well, that's what I'm saying. The lessons come out of a pattern that is repeated endlessly. And I'm just wondering, as a modern day from Jew, I'm trying to wonder what this was all recorded and presented for posterity so that we can,
learn from our mistakes and not repeat them.
yeah, but wouldn't you
Now,
think that,
there are a
I
lot of
mean,
different mistakes, and therefore there
yeah,
are a lot of lessons
because
to
we're
learn.
talking about 350 years here and 350, we're talking about how long from the beginning of Yoshua till the end of Trey Asar?
Almost 1,000 years.
1,000 years. So when you see a pattern recurring for 1,000 years, you have to say to yourself, should I give up? Um, I mean, what
So let me
message?
conclude with this. Let me conclude with this, and I'm gonna, because of time, I'm gonna conclude the shir with an answer to this question, and then I will be happy to um, feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat, and we'll be happy to continue the conversation uh, as you know as works for you. But I've said this often. I want to repeat it here. Unfortunately for us, Tanakh doesn't share the same kind of Musar philosophy that modern contemporary educators have, which is that as much as you critique what we do wrong, you also have to highlight what we do right. Positive reinforcement is a very big part of what we see as a process of Musar today, right? You don't identify what we only do wrong, you also identify what we do right. That concept didn't exist in Tanakh. And so, and I showed you those 4 verses in chapter 3. When they
Mhm.
got it right, all Tanakh wrote was the land was quiet for 40 years. 40
Right.
years is 2 generations. That means that for 2 generations, we got it right. And for
Mhm.
a blip on the radar, we got it wrong. We have story of Neban Knaz, and we have the next story. The blips on the radar are what Sefer Shoftim will highlight. There's 7 or 8 of them in the course of 350 years. There's also 150 years worth of, or close to almost 200 years worth of the people, the land was quiet for 40 years or 80 years.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
therefore the people were doing good. But
Mhm.
Tanakh doesn't do that. It doesn't tell us. So that's the problem, is
Right.
that the book of Yeshua was written as the value. The Chazal say that if the people had never sinned, they would have been given the Torah and the book of Yeshua, because it describes the entrance of Israel. I'm just going to mute the background sounds for 1 second. Um, the Gemara says that had we never sinned, we would have been given the Chumash and the book of Yeshua. And that would have been the end of the story. So the rest of Tanakh is where we went wrong. So of course, I've said this many times, Tanakh is not a happy-go-lucky book. It's not a book that makes you feel good. It's not, you can't read Sefer Shoftim or Sefer Shmuel or the Book of Kings and say, hey, great, pat ourselves on the back. Unfortunately, but we have to learn it too, because we have to learn from our mistakes. But
Thank you.
there's a lot that we did right, and we have to acknowledge that too.
Thank you. That was a very good presentation and an excellent response.
My pleasure. All the best to you. B'ezrat Hashem, we'll see you all next week. It's been fun, and we will continue the journey together.
Thank you very much.
Rabbi. It's wonderful learning with you again.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do any of the Mefarshim wonder why God doesn't punish Bnei Israel with withdrawal of rain, as Moshe Rabbeinu predicts in Dvarim?
I'm not sure that he doesn't. Withdrawal of rain has various forms. Rain doesn't have to only be rain, it can be hunger in other forms as well. And you see droughts in various periods of Tanakh as well. But there are many tools in God's basket, so to speak. So I don't know if I answered that question, but that's all right. Be well, everybody. I'm going to sign off. Pleasure to see you all.